Tonight we're going somewhere cold, but not the kind of cold that lives in snow. A different cold, one that lives in the soles of your boots after marching for weeks, and in the letters that never arrive, and in the space between your name and the uniform they've sewn it onto. We're stepping into the life of a soldier, not one remembered by statues or books, but one who carried the musket, the hunger, the silence. A soldier under Napoleon, one of many, one of too many. You didn't volunteer, not really. You were chosen. By a lottery, by a law, by a whisper that said France needed you more than your family did. And once your name was read aloud, it was no longer yours. You belonged to the empire, to the eagle, to something that didn't blink when you cried. This isn't about Waterloo, or Austerlitz, or maps drawn by generals. This is about what it felt like to lace boots that didn't fit, to sleep beside men who might not wake up, and to march toward a horizon that never got closer. Don't worry, you don't need to carry anything. Just close your eyes and listen. He'll walk you through it now. The letter that changed everything. You were mending a fence when they came, or hauling grain, or brushing mud off a cart that hadn't moved in days. It doesn't matter. You were doing something ordinary. That's how it always starts. Ordinary things. Then the sound of hooves, a name. Your name. Read aloud like a verdict. You stood there, not surprised. Not really. You'd heard the talk in the tavern, seen the lists nailed to the post near the well. You just didn't think it would be you. But then it was. And they handed you the paper, folded, still warm from someone else's hand, the seal unbroken. You didn't open it right away. Not in front of them. You waited until they left. Until the dust settled, and the dog stopped barking, and the wind returned to its old rhythm. Then you sat on the same log your father once carved into with a dull knife. And you read the words, not quickly, not out of panic, just slowly. Because once read, they couldn't be unread. Your name, your age, your assigned regiment. You had 10 days. No appeals, no refusals. The empire doesn't negotiate with farmers. You folded the paper again, not carefully, just enough to hide it. You didn't sleep much that night. The roof creaked in the usual places. The fire went out too early. You lay on your side and watched the wall and thought about boots. You didn't own a proper pair. Not for marching. Not for the kind of distance that makes your knees forget how to bend. Your mother cried when you told her. Not loud, not begging. Just soft and steady like she already knew. Maybe she did. Maybe the way your voice broke when you said you were going was enough. Your father didn't speak. He stood near the stove and poured something into a cup and stared at it like it might offer different news. The village sent off 3 others that week. One kissed his wife with both hands shaking. One left before sunrise without saying goodbye. The 3rd never showed up. They found his body in the woods 2 days later, hanging. No note, just his boots, neatly placed beneath him. The priest didn't say much at the burial. He didn't need to. Everyone understood. Some things are louder without words. On the 9th day, you packed a small bag, dried meat, a carved spoon, a shirt that didn't itch too badly. You didn't take much. They told you the army would give you what you needed. Uniform, weapon, orders. You weren't afraid. Not then. Not exactly. Fear needs shape, and this didn't have one yet. Just a direction. East toward a place whose name you couldn't pronounce. And a man whose face you'd never seen. Only the symbol, the eagle. And the promise that if you served well enough, long enough, you might come home with something to show for it. If you came home at all, boots too big and bread too small, they gave you boots on the 2nd day, after the walk to the barracks. After the man with the notebook asked your name twice and still spelled it wrong. After they shaved your hair and handed you something they called a uniform. but smelled like someone else's sweat. The boots came last, too big, cracked at the seams, stuffed with old straw that poked through your socks and made your heels bleed before you'd even taken a proper step. You didn't complain. The others didn't either. There were boys beside you who had never worn boots before. One tried to smile through it. He stopped smiling by evening. They gave you bread that first night, a hard lump that felt like it had been baked a year ago. You bit down and thought you cracked a tooth. No one laughed. No one spoke much at all. The barracks were cold, loud in some places, too quiet in others. Men shuffled like ghosts between their bunks. There was snoring, whimpering. One man slept with a knife in his hand. Another kept muttering someone's name over and over until he coughed himself quiet. You didn't sleep well again. You stared at the ceiling, thought about your boots, thought about the dirt under your bed, wondered how long the straw inside your soles would last, wondered if it mattered. In the morning, they made you run, not far, just enough to make your lungs pull at your ribs and your breath come out in smoke. The boots clapped against the ground like they didn't want to follow your feet. Your toes burned. Your socks bled. The boy who smiled fell behind. No one stopped for him. The officer didn't look back. At breakfast there was bread again, and a bowl of something that used to be soup. You chewed it because you were hungry, because it was food, because it might be the last warm thing you tasted for weeks. The officers told you about glory, about France, about the emperor. You listened because listening kept you out of trouble. But your eyes wandered to the window behind them, to the trees, the smoke, the sky, anything that didn't feel like marching, that didn't smell like unwashed cloth and boiled nothing. They taught you how to hold a musket that week, how to load it, how to fire it, how to clean it with fingers that shook too much in the cold. You practiced until your shoulders ached and your ears rang and your thoughts got too quiet. The boots never softened. The bread never got better. And by the 7th night, the boy who used to smile wasn't in his bed anymore. He didn't leave, but he wasn't there. The officers didn't explain. They just made the rest of you line up again, and you did, with bleeding feet, with empty bellies, with names that no longer felt like yours, because soon none of that would matter. Soon you would be marching, not toward glory, but away from everything you used to know. Drilled until the sky went dark, they woke you before the sun, always before, as if the world might forget you existed, if you didn't claim your place in it early enough. Boots on, shirt pulled, canteen checked, no time for bread, just movement. Rows of men blinking sleep from their eyes, lining up like it mattered, like neatness might save you later. It wouldn't, but you did it anyway, because the man with the stick watched too closely, and the one beside him never blinked when someone fell behind. They called it drill, but it felt more like a punishment no one had earned. Left foot, right foot, step, pivot, shoulder, turn. Repeat. The words became a rhythm so dull. It stopped sounding like language. The ground wore smooth beneath your heels. You lost track of your breath, then of time, then of self. You weren't marching. You were being marched. Hands blistered from the wooden stock. Mouth dry from the cold. Eyes narrowed, not from focus but from wind and dirt. You counted clouds to distract yourself. But the sky stayed the same, just grey, then darker, then black. The officer barked, someone fell, the line didn't stop. He got up, or maybe he didn't. No one looked back. You felt something pop in your knee that afternoon, not a snap, just a shift, something that whispered it would never be the same. You leaned a little more to the left and hoped no one noticed. They didn't. Or they did and didn't care. Either way, the drill kept going. That night, the boots came off slow. You peeled your sock from your heel like it was part of your skin. It bled onto the floor, a red print, quiet. No one said anything. Someone near you had started coughing, not small, not casual, deep and wet and curling at the edges. He didn't eat the next morning, just sat with the bowl in his lap like it might warm his fingers if he held it long enough. You didn't ask. You didn't want the answer. By then you'd learned. Questions didn't change anything. They just reminded you how little you knew. The officer came in later, said the Emperor was pleased. That France would be proud. You looked at your boots again. The toe stitching was gone. The sole bent when you pressed it. You thought of home, of your father's spade, of the way bread used to smell when it was fresh. You knew those thoughts wouldn't help, but they came anyway, like steam from your breath, rising, disappearing. The man who coughed didn't get out of bed the next day. The rest of you drilled. No one asked. No one stopped. The line just moved around the empty space and the sky. It stayed dark, as if it too had learned how to march without looking back. Marches that never ended. They said it was just a short march, 2 days, maybe 3, a village to pass through, a river to cross. Nothing difficult. You packed what you had left. Your feet were already raw. Your boots had taken on water the week before and never dried. You stuffed more straw into the heel and hoped for something soft. You didn't find it. Hard as bone you chewed. Anyway, the road was a thin stretch of frozen mud that tried to pull the soles from your shoes. The man in front of you walked with a limp. The man behind you didn't speak. No one did. Not once the frost found your throat. It wasn't the distance that hurt. It was the sameness. Trees that looked like the last trees. Fields with no animals, houses with no smoke. Just wind and sky and the crunch of worn leather hitting stone. The sun stayed low all day, then vanished too quickly. You slept in a barn that night. No fire. Just the breath of 30 men and the cold weight of straw against your cheek. Someone snored. Someone whispered a prayer. Someone didn't wake up. You didn't know who until the line moved the next morning, and a body stayed behind, covered in a coat that wasn't his. The rest of you kept walking. No one asked. The road stretched further than your thoughts. You stopped counting steps. You stopped counting days. You measured time by the wear in your boots, by the way your shoulders ached when the musket shifted wrong, by the moment you stopped looking at the sky. It offered no change. The officers rode ahead, their horses better fed than the men. You watched their breath cloud in the cold and wondered if they ever felt the blisters, if their legs had ever bled through wool, if they knew what it meant to march not towards something, but simply away from where you had been. The river came on the 5th day. It wasn't wide, but it was fast, icy. They built a bridge from barrels and rope. You crossed one at a time. Your foot slipped once and you thought you were done, but a hand gripped your collar, a boy younger than you. He didn't speak, just nodded once and moved ahead. That night you shared what was left of your bread. He saved you. You fed him. That was the agreement. The next morning he was gone. No blood, no sound, just gone. You marched anyway, because the line kept moving, because the road never ended, because your boots would fall apart before your orders did. And somewhere far ahead, they said, was another field, another camp, another war you didn't understand. You no longer asked where. You just marched because stopping wasn't an option, and because behind you nothing waited. The smell of gunpowder and damp wool, you smelled it before you saw anything, sharp and bitter. Not like firewood or cooking or smoke from a chimney. This was something different. It clung to your tongue, bit at your nose, made your eyes sting before the wind even shifted. Gunpowder burned too quickly and left behind a smell that never washed out. You didn't know the battle had started. Not really, no one told you. There was no drum, no trumpet, just the line stopping too suddenly and the officers whispering faster than usual, and then the sound, not a roar, just a pop, then another. And then something louder. You didn't see who fell first. You just heard it. A sound like breath punched from the chest, and then more. A man crying out, not for his mother, not for God, just for someone to make it stop. They pushed you forward. You stepped where he had stood. His musket lay near your foot, still warm, still loaded. You didn't ask what happened to yours. It was just gone. The line moved again. You followed because everyone else did. The ground was wet, not from rain, from something thicker. You didn't look down after that. The smoke moved in patches, thick in some places, thin enough to see sunlight in others. It made shapes if you stared too long. You stopped staring. Somewhere ahead someone shouted to fire, so you did. You lifted the musket and aimed at nothing. Just the place where the noise came from. You didn't see who it hit, or if it hit at all. The kick bruised your shoulder. Your hands shook. You reloaded. You fired again. Not because you believed in anything, but because your fingers knew what came next. You watched a man collapse near a tree, his mouth open. No sound. Just surprise. You recognized him. Not his name, just the way he walked. You'd seen him steal extra rations once and give half to someone else. He bled into the leaves like it didn't matter. You fired again, then again. You couldn't remember how many times. The smoke didn't lift. It thickened. The cries changed pitch. The officers yelled louder. A cannon fired. The ground moved beneath your feet. You didn't fall. You didn't run. You just stood there until someone grabbed your arm and pulled you back. You followed, not knowing why, not caring where. The musket slipped from your hands and you didn't reach for it. Your boots felt heavier. The wool of your coat stuck to your skin, wet cold, smelling of fire and sweat and blood and something else you couldn't name. You didn't speak that night. No one did. They fed you something warm. You didn't taste it. You sat beside the fire and listened to someone sob through a mouthful of cloth. A man to your left whispered a name. It wasn't yours. It wasn't his. Just someone he hoped was still breathing. You closed your eyes and smelled the powder again. It was in your hair, in your throat, in your silence. It would not leave. The man next to you had no name. He arrived during the night, or maybe before. You weren't sure. Sleep had started coming in pieces, small moments behind your eyes that didn't last long enough to rest. When you woke, he was already beside you, wrapped in a coat too thin for the cold, holding a tin cup he didn't drink from. He didn't speak, just nodded once when your eyes met, like he had been waiting to be seen. You didn't ask his name. He didn't ask yours. There was no point. Names didn't last anymore. The last man who shared his name had vanished by morning. No sound, no reason, just an empty spot where his pack had been. The new man had a scar along his jaw. You watched him wrap a strip of cloth around his foot. No sock, just cloth. He moved carefully, like everything already hurt. You understood. They moved you out by dawn. He marched beside you, same pace, same silence. When the wind blew hard, he gave you a look, almost a smile, like you both knew what it meant to freeze from the inside out. You walked for hours or longer. The sky never changed, just grey. The trees thinned, then thickened, then thinned again. You passed a cart stuck in the mud. 2 bodies inside, covered with a blanket. No one spoke about it. Not even the officers that night. You shared a fire, just the 2 of you. He handed you. You took it without thanks. He didn't expect any. You chewed slowly. It was raw. It didn't matter. Warmth was in the act of chewing. That was enough. In the dark, he hummed something low. Not a song you knew. just notes, rough and slow. You closed your eyes to the sound. It reminded you of the wind before storms, steady, distant. He stopped once, mid-note, coughed into his sleeve. You saw the blood but said nothing. The fire cracked. You didn't look at each other again. In the morning, he walked slower. He didn't say why. You matched his pace. That afternoon, they made camp by a frozen stream. He knelt to fill his cup. His hands shook. He dropped it. The metal rang once, then stilled. You picked it up for him, held it out. He looked at you like he was trying to remember something. Then he smiled. Not wide, just enough. You handed him the cup. He drank, then sat down, then closed his eyes. You waited. The others built fires. The officers shouted. The sky turned pale. Nothing. His face was calm still. Not twisted like some. Just still. You didn't call for help. You took the cloth from his foot. Yours had worn through again. You wrapped it tight, stood, walked to the line. The man beside you asked where your friend had gone. You shrugged. He didn't ask again. You didn't cry. You didn't pray. The march continued. The man next to you had no name. Now he had no footsteps either. Cold fires and warm lies they told you the worst was over, that the next march would be shorter, that supplies were coming, that the enemy had already pulled back. You heard the officer say it with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. You didn't believe him. No one did. But you nodded like you did, because lies, said gently, are easier to hold than truth spoken plain. You packed what you had left, a scrap of cloth, the man's cup, a chunk of root that wasn't soft enough to eat, but kept your mouth moving. The wind had changed, colder now, sharper. It hissed through the trees like it knew something you didn't. That night you tried to light a fire. The wood was wet. It hissed and spit and smoked, but gave no heat. Still, you sat beside it, hands stretched out like it might warm you anyway. Just the act of pretending was something. One of the younger men asked if it would snow. You looked at the sky and said, not yet. He thanked you, believed you. Maybe that was the worst part. They still looked at you like you knew things, just because you'd lasted longer, just because you hadn't frozen or starved or vanished in the night. You didn't tell them about the others, about the man with the cloth wrapped foot, about the coughing, the humming, the quiet end. You let them think he was reassigned, or that he walked ahead now, someplace better. You saw one of them sneak a piece of biscuit to a boy with no gloves. You saw another tie his scarf around someone else's throat. You didn't stop them. Small mercies kept the cold out better than blankets. Morning came grey and slow. The frost didn't melt. The bread cracked when you bit it. Your teeth hurt. Your boots leaked. You kept walking. One man fell near the edge of the path, just sat down like he meant to rest for a moment. His hands in his lap, his mouth still moving. You waited for someone to call him, to lift him, but no one did. You didn't either. You told yourself he just needed time, that he'd catch up, even as his breath slowed, even as the line moved forward without him. That night, the fire finally caught. Dry wood found beneath a fallen cart. The warmth made some of the men cry, just quiet tears they didn't name. You sat with your hands spread wide and felt nothing. Not heat, not cold. Just something in between. The officer walked by, said the worst was behind you, said you were heading home soon, that the emperor was proud. You nodded again, said nothing. Your hands still hovered over the flame. They didn't shake anymore. The skin was cracked, raw in places. You watched the fire flicker, listened to the lie, and let yourself believe it, just for the night. Because in the morning, the boots would tighten again, and the worst would come again, as it always did quietly, without warning, with frost on its breath, Letters you never sent. You started writing the first one after the 4th March, or maybe the 5th. You weren't keeping count anymore, just a name at the top, your mother's. The page stayed blank for a while. You held the charcoal stick between your fingers and stared at the paper, like it might write itself if you waited long enough. The words didn't come. You wrote, "I am well," even though you weren't. You crossed it out, wrote it again, left it. You didn't mention the man with no name, or the fire that wouldn't burn, or the way your feet had gone numb somewhere, past the frozen orchard, and never come back. Instead, you asked about the garden, about the dog, about the way the house creaked when the wind came from the north. You knew she'd never read it. You had no way to send it. But writing made your hands feel like they still belonged to you, so you folded the letter and tucked it under your shirt, close to your skin, like it might keep something alive. You wrote another one a week later, this one to your sister. You told her not to marry the blacksmith's son, said she should wait for someone who didn't drink so early in the day. You said it as if the world outside still worked the way it used to, as if love could be planned like planting season. You didn't know why you wrote that. You barely remembered what his face looked like. The next letter was for no one, just a string of sentences about the cold, about the smell of gunpowder still clinging to your coat, about the way the snow made no sound when you walked through it. You folded it anyway, kept it beside the others. A man caught you once scribbling by the fire, asked if it was your will. You shook your head. He nodded like he understood, didn't ask again. Some nights you took them out and read them to yourself, whispered them just loud enough to remember how your voice sounded when it wasn't shaking. You never read them aloud, never let anyone hear. They weren't for sharing, they were for surviving. When your hands grew too stiff to write, you still pretended, traced invisible lines onto your thigh beneath the blanket, pressed names into the dirt beside the fire. You thought maybe the earth would carry them home. One morning, a gust of wind caught one, lifted it from your pocket and sent it spinning across the snow. You didn't chase it, just watched. The words scattered before they reached the trees. Someone asked if it was something important. You said no, just a letter, one of many. Written in a war where nothing arrived where it was meant to, where names were forgotten before boots stopped bleeding, where truth lived in your chest but never made it home. The sound before the cannon roars, you never really hear it coming. Not until it's too late. The march had slowed that morning. You thought it was another delay, another stretch of waiting between orders. The air was thick with something unspoken. The men were quieter. The officers walked ahead with their heads low, and still you couldn't place it. The sky stayed grey. The snow kept falling like it hadn't noticed. You were waiting for it to stop. You were walking when it came. A sound that felt like it was in your chest before it reached your ears. Low, heavy, like the earth itself had groaned and cracked. And then you heard the roar. Not a shout, not a scream. Just a low, distant thunder, the kind that doesn't seem real until you feel the ground shudder under your boots. The man in front of you didn't stop walking. He just looked ahead. His face was pale, but he didn't ask. He didn't look at anyone else. He didn't even check the direction the sound came from. His hands stayed still by his side, like he had already forgotten how to hold a musket. You didn't stop either. Not then. Not when you knew the sound was close, but not close enough to see. Not yet. It was too early for the cannon, but the way it shook the air, the way it made everything else seem too small to matter. You couldn't stop thinking that it wasn't a cannon at all. You wanted to turn, to look, to shout something, to say anything that might make the world feel normal again. But you didn't. The men kept marching, the boots kept moving, but there was a space between you and the others now, a distance that couldn't be closed. The second shot came like the first, too sudden to measure. And then, after a beat that dragged longer than it should have, the third. The line stopped this time. But not because anyone gave the order. The line stopped because you all felt it, the weight of it. The way your heart stopped for a second before it kicked back to life. Too fast, too uneven. Someone ahead shouted. It was a warning. You didn't hear it. You didn't need to. You felt it in your bones. Then the shots came closer, like they were finding their way to you. The ground shook harder, not enough to knock you down, but enough to make you stumble. Enough to remind you that the war you had been walking toward wasn't distant anymore. It had found its way to you. A soldier in front of you turned finally and looked at you. His eyes wide, his breath sharp in the cold. "Ready your musket," he said. You nodded without thinking. Your hands moved faster than your thoughts. You didn't check the barrel. Didn't wonder if the powder was dry. You didn't care if the gun would fire. You only cared that it felt like everything was about to break. You raised it anyway. You pointed it at something you couldn't see. The roar came again, this time closer, louder. Like a beast about to strike. You pulled the trigger, but it wasn't the sound of your shot you heard. It was the sound of the cannon roaring back, and this time it felt too close to run from. Sleep that stole you mid. Sentence you had just finished a sentence when it happened. The words hung there in the air, suspended between your mouth and the men beside you. They were words about nothing important. Just the name of a town you had passed. A joke that felt a little too tired. A piece of news from a man ahead. But you didn't hear the end of it. Not because the words didn't matter, but because sleep came without warning, without choice. 1 second you were awake. 1 second you were talking. The next, the world blurred. It didn't come in a wave, not the way exhaustion usually hits. It crept. It snuck in like a shadow behind you, soft and cold, like it knew it didn't need to ask. Another. And the ground was suddenly there beneath you, pulling you toward it like it was always meant to. The soldiers beside you didn't notice. They kept walking. The march kept moving. No one slowed. No one saw how the world went hazy around the edges. You had been talking, and then, in the space of a breath, you weren't. No heavy head, no closing eyes, no back. It was a slip, an absence, like your mind had decided to step out of its own body and leave the rest of you to figure it out. You didn't fall. You didn't stumble. You just stopped. When you opened your eyes again, it was dark, but not in the way night falls slowly. This was sudden, like someone had pulled a curtain too fast across the sky. You didn't know where, not until you blinked and saw the fire ahead. The officers still walking, their steps too steady for the stillness around you. It was quiet, too quiet. The men didn't talk. They didn't laugh. They just walked, their shadows long in the pale moonlight. The cold from the ground seeped through your boots, through your bones. And you tried to stand, but your legs didn't answer right away. They felt too far away, like they didn't belong to you. The world felt distant, too far to reach, but you reached anyway. The first step was a shiver. The second was a question. And the third made your legs burn. But the sleep didn't let go. You could still taste it on your tongue, bitter and unasked for. Like the feeling of having missed something, but not being able to remember what it was. The men beside you kept walking. No one turned, no one stopped. You moved slower now, feet heavy, breath still trapped somewhere behind your ribs. It wasn't the march that was hard. It was the stillness in between, the absence of sleep, the way it stole time without asking. You tried to catch up, but your feet dragged. The fire was further now. The march kept going. You kept falling behind, one step at a time. You didn't know if you'd ever catch up, or if somewhere along the way you'd forgotten how to try. What the battlefield smells like, it doesn't smell like fire. Not at first. At first, it smells like earth. Mud churned under the weight of boots and bodies. It smells like sweat, but not the clean kind. This is the kind that sticks to your skin thick and wet, until you can't tell where the blood ends and the dirt begins. It smells like iron, but not the cool, sharp scent you're used to in the forge. This is iron that's old and rusted, soaked into the earth with the weight of things you can't name. When the sun rises over the field, you can't see it at first. The smoke from the fires hides it, but once the smoke clears, the ground is stained dark and the smell comes stronger. It's not just the iron, it's the stench of blood that refuses to leave. It clings to the air, to the dirt, to your lungs. It makes your stomach twist, but it doesn't make you retch. Not at first. You've been here too long. You've learned what to swallow. There's something else in the air too. Something sour, something rotting. Maybe it's the animals left behind. Maybe it's the bodies. You don't ask. The bodies pile up too quickly. They aren't even soldiers anymore. Just husks. Just pieces of something that used to be. The flies find them quickly. They feast. It doesn't take long before the stench of death mixes with the earth, the sweat, and the blood. They all blur together until it's just one thick, choking cloud that fills your nose. The smell is so strong that it doesn't even seem real anymore. Your head gets light. Your feet feel heavier with every step. And the worst part is that you've stopped noticing. You've learned how to breathe it in. You've learned how to keep walking through it, even when it sticks to your clothes and your skin. You can't stop. Not now. Not in the middle of it. It's not just the smell, though. It's the sound, too. The wet slap of boots in the mud. The scream of a man who hasn't quite died yet. The scrape of a weapon dragged through the dirt. But the smell, that's the worst part. It seeps into your bones. It stays there long after the fighting's done, long after the blood's been washed away. It's the first thing you remember when you wake up, and it's the last thing you forget when you're dead. You don't ever get it out of your nose. It becomes a part of you, and maybe that's what the battlefield is. Not just a place, but a memory that never leaves, a smell that you carry with you, long after the last shot is fired, long after you stop counting the bodies. The surgeon's table was always full. It was always full. No matter the day, no matter the battle, the surgeon's table was always full. Full of men, full of blood, full of wounds too deep to heal. You didn't look at their faces. Not at first, you couldn't. They were too far gone to matter. The only thing that mattered was the wound, the gash, the tear, the sound of a sword finding its mark, the hollow crack of a bone shattering. You didn't speak to them at first. There was no point, not when they couldn't hear you over the screams. The screams were always the hardest part. They never stopped, even when the men passed out. Even when the blood drained from their bodies, the screams still echoed. It didn't matter how many soldiers lay on the table, how many hands tried to hold them still, how many instruments you used. The screams were the constant. You were numb to the sound of it, you had to be. It was the only way to keep going. The blood didn't bother you either. You stopped seeing it after a while, stopped seeing the way it soaked into the floor, into the bandages, into the men who passed out before you could even finish. It became a part of the process, like the way a body breathes. The blood would flow, and you would stop it sometimes. Other times, the flow didn't stop. Other times, the blood kept coming. The men didn't always make it. You couldn't save them all. You tried. You always tried. But sometimes the wounds were too deep, the damage too great. When they died, the table became just another place. Another reminder of how close you were to it all. But you didn't let that thought linger. You couldn't. You kept moving from one to the next, wiping sweat from your brow, wiping the blood from your hands, never thinking of the next man as anything but a set of wounds to fix. You didn't know their names, not really. You learned them only when you had to, when their eyes were still open and their mouths still spoke. You would ask them about the family they came from, and they would tell you, but it didn't matter. You'd move on to the next soldier before their story finished. Some of them begged, some of them swore. Some of them were silent, but you couldn't care about. You could only care about the wound and the next and the next. The surgeon's table was always full, but you weren't a healer. You weren't here to save them. You were just here to keep them from dying on the table for a little longer. And then, when you couldn't do that anymore, you'd close your eyes, wipe the blood from your hands, and wait for the next. Because there was always a next. Your hunger learned to wait. Hunger wasn't something that arrived all at once. It crept up slow and steady until it became a part of you. In the beginning, you ignored it. The empty stomach, the gnawing ache, the dry mouth. You could push it aside, keep it at arm's length, pretend it didn't matter. But as the days stretched on and the food ran out, hunger didn't leave. It didn't give up. It simply sat with you. At the back of your mind, a quiet, constant companion. You learned its rhythm, the way it would ease for a moment after a hard march, a full breath, the feel of the cold air in your lungs. It would quiet itself for just a little while, like it was satisfied with the promise of something to come. But the promise never came. You didn't know where the rations went. They were supposed to come with the wagons, supposed to arrive with the officers, but each time there was less bread, less meat, less water. You told yourself it was just for today. Tomorrow would be better. Tomorrow the hunger would be something you could deal with. But tomorrow never came. You started to understand that. You started to feel hunger differently. It wasn't something to shove down or ignore. Hunger learned to wait, and so did you. It wasn't in the pit of your stomach anymore. It was in your bones, in your skin, in the way your thoughts slowed down when you stopped moving. It was in the space between the sounds of the march, in the silence that hung after every word you didn't say. Your body wasn't yours anymore. It was just a shell waiting for something it could never have. You learned the language of hunger. Not the way it made your stomach twist, not the way it stole your breath, but the way it kept you still, the way it kept you quiet. You stopped looking at the men around you, at the last scraps they couldn't swallow. You stopped looking at the trees, hoping that a miracle would drop down in the form of a fruit, or a rabbit, or something you could eat. You stopped hoping. You learned to wait. Your hunger wasn't the same now. It wasn't sharp, not like it used to be. It was more like a dull ache, a pressure, something that made every step heavier but didn't stop you from moving forward. You kept going because that's what you did. You kept walking, kept marching, even when your legs felt like lead and your feet left nothing but empty marks in the dirt. Hunger didn't break you. It didn't make you weak. It taught you patience. And patience, in the end, was the only thing you had left. You learned to wait, and waiting, you found, was the hardest part of all. Crossing the Alps felt like dying sideways. The wind cut through the pass like a blade. It didn't ask if you were ready. It didn't care if you could take it. It just came, sharp and relentless, sweeping over the mountains, sending gusts that struck like a slap and made you flinch even when you tried to stand tall against it. The snow was like gravel, biting at your face, stinging your eyes until the world blurred. It was everything you could do to keep your feet on the ground, and even that wasn't enough. Every step felt like it might be your last, not because the enemy was coming for you, but because nature itself had decided that you didn't belong here. You weren't meant to walk this high, this far, in this moving, trying to keep pace with the men around you. The Alps were unforgiving. The path was narrow, treacherous, a slip away from the void, and you didn't know what hurt worse, the weight of the pack on your back or the weight of the mountain pressing down on you from all sides. Crossing the Alps didn't feel like crossing at all. It felt like dying sideways, the mountain towering above you, the air thinning until your breath came in ragged bursts, until your lungs burned like they might collapse. You kept going because you had no choice. There was no turning back. The men beside you, some silent, some muttering curses under their breath, moved forward like ghosts, faces hollowed out by hunger and fatigue. No one spoke of stopping. No one spoke of the impossibility of it all. The cold seeped into your bones, so deep it didn't matter how many layers you wore. It found its way into your flesh, into your soul, until the world itself felt like ice. It was as if you were becoming a part of the mountain, your feet sinking deeper with every step, your body too tired to resist, your mind too numb to care. At times you thought you might fall, not from weakness, but from sheer exhaustion. But then you'd hear the sound of someone else stumbling behind you, and you'd push yourself forward again, driven by nothing more than the instinct to survive, to keep going, to endure. The air was thin, the snow was thick, and you wondered if you'd ever see the warmth again, if you'd ever feel the sun on your face, if you'd ever hear the sound of a campfire crackling and know that you'd made it. But in the Alps there was no warmth, no sun, no end in sight. Only the cold, the wind, the mountain, and the quiet, constant ache in your chest that told you might just be dying sideways without ever knowing it. The retreat no one wants to remember. It was never spoken of as a retreat. Not to the men who stood in the frozen mud, their breath visible in the air, their faces streaked with dirt and exhaustion. It wasn't a retreat. It was a flight, a desperate scramble back to something that might have been safety once, but had long since been swallowed up by the same nightmare that chased them. No one wanted to remember it. Not the officers who gave the order, not the soldiers who obeyed it. It was the kind of retreat that didn't feel like a retreat at all. It felt like running away, running from the mountains that had almost broken you, from the hunger that had gnawed at your bones, from the men who had fallen beside you and left nothing but a name to carry on the wind. The ground was uneven beneath your feet, not like the firm, solid ground of a march. It felt like it might give way with every step, like you might fall through the earth and never be seen again. The road behind you was filled with the dead, the wounded, the ones who had never made it out of the cold, out of the battle, out of the hunger. You could hear their whispers in the wind, the groans, the cries, the ones who hadn't survived to see the retreat, but had begged you to carry them with you anyway. It didn't matter now, they were gone. You were still moving, though you weren't sure why anymore. The noise of the march was different now too. It wasn't the steady thrum of feet moving forward. It was chaos, a mess of orders shouted into the wind, the desperate clamour of men scrambling to keep pace with the officers ahead of them. Some ran, some stumbled, some just walked, numb to the whole thing. You could smell it on them, the fear, the sweat, the desperation. You could taste it in the air, thick and heavy like it was drowning you too. You couldn't tell who was leading the retreat anymore. The officers, their uniforms stained and frayed, or the soldiers, pulling themselves along like ghosts, in a world that had stopped caring if they lived or died. No one talked. No one asked. They just moved, eyes to the ground, feet shifting in the mud, hoping the world might give them one more chance. One more step before the darkness took everything they had left. But it didn't come. The retreat didn't slow. The end didn't come. It just kept moving, kept dragging them deeper into the woods, into the night, into the cold. The retreat no one wanted to remember wasn't about the battle lost. It wasn't about the men who died. It wasn't even about the hunger or the cold. It was about the silence. The kind of silence that wrapped itself around you like a blanket of snow, leaving you with nothing but the sound of your own breath and the weight of the men who had already given up. You couldn't say it, but you felt it. The retreat wasn't just the loss of ground, it was the loss of hope, and when you looked around, you realized that no one was running anymore. They were just walking through a nightmare that wouldn't end. When you stopped saying his name, you used to say it with pride. Back when your uniform was still clean and the men sang songs around the fire, his name sat high in your mouth then, sharp, bright, certain. You believed in it. You believed it meant something, that it stood for something more than victory, more than war, more than one man's ambition. You said it like a shield, like if you spoke it loud enough, the cold wouldn't bite so hard, the hunger wouldn't hollow so deep, the cannon wouldn't echo in your ears for days. But then came the march, the weeks without food, the cold that turned your hands grey, the silence that followed the retreat, and somewhere between the mountains and the mud, you stopped saying it. At first you said it softer, not in song, not in pride, just in passing, just to answer when someone asked what side you were on. Then not at all, because no one asked any more. The men stopped speaking of him, not out of betrayal, but because the name didn't fit anymore. It didn't match the road ahead, or the bodies behind. It didn't warm your back or fill your cup. It didn't follow you into sleep. It didn't stop your friend from dying in the snow. It just hung there, pointless, empty, so you let it go. The name that had once meant glory now felt like a weight in your mouth, like speaking it might summon something too heavy to carry. Some still whispered it when they thought no one could hear. Usually the new ones, the ones who hadn't yet seen a man chew leather to stay alive. But most of you said nothing, not in reverence, not in rebellion, just in quiet understanding. When the orders came, you followed them, not because of him, because it was easier than thinking, easier than hope. And when the battle began again, when the guns lit up the sky and the smoke curled thick into your lungs, no one raised a cheer for him. No one cried out his name into the roar. You just moved like shadows across a field that didn't want you. You held your weapon. You took the next step. You bled. But not for him. Not anymore. Someone asked once, "What do we do if he dies?" The question felt strange, like asking what to do if the wind changed direction. You didn't answer. You didn't need to, because he wasn't leading anymore. Not really. He was far away, somewhere dry. Somewhere where fires stayed lit and boots stayed dry, and names were still said like they meant something. But not here, not in the mud, not in the frost-bitten silence where men slept with their eyes open, where loyalty was no longer spoken, only endured. You stopped saying his name the day it no longer protected you, and no one blamed you, because when you're marching toward the end, names don't matter. Only footsteps, only breath, only the will to take one more step. The boots you took from a dead friend, they didn't fit, not really. A little too wide at the heel, stiff in the ankles, scuffed in places you didn't want to look at. But they were dry, and yours were not. Yours had split 2 days before, soles peeling like bark off a drowned tree, letting in slush and snow until your toes went numb. The pain came and went, which scared you more than when it stayed. So when you found him in the snow, face turned toward the sky, lips parted like he was just about to speak, you looked at the boots before you looked at the wound. They were still tied, still intact, still his. His name was Fétienne. You hadn't known him long, just enough to share a fire once, pass bread back and forth between shivering hands. Listen to him hum a song you'd never heard before. He didn't say much, but when he did, it was always about home. Always the same field, always the same sister. He'd died fast, it looked like. No blood on the snow, just the slackness of a face surprised by silence. You knelt beside him and said nothing, not a prayer, not an apology, just took off your ruined boots and slid his off slowly, gently, like he might feel it. You kept waiting for him to twitch, to cough, to open his eyes and laugh, but he didn't. He stayed still. He let you take them. You told yourself he would have wanted that. Told yourself he'd said it once. By the fire. If I go, take what you need. Maybe he hadn't. Maybe you made that part up. But the boots were warm, and they held, and they kept your skin from breaking. That night someone noticed, looked at the boot, just nodded once, slow. The kind of nod that says we all do what we must. The kind that says grief will have to wait. They started moulding to your feet after a while. The creases, the bends, the worn spots, they became yours. But you never stopped feeling like you were borrowing them. You didn't forget whose steps came first. You didn't forget whose warmth lingered in the lining. Every time you looked down, you saw his name, even if you never carved it in. You stopped talking about Fétienne, not because you wanted to forget, but because memory had grown too heavy to carry with the rations. But his boots carried you, through frost, through ash, through the long quiet of retreat. They didn't ask anything of you, only that you keep moving. Only that you walk a little further than he could. You still wonder if he sees you, if he knows you wore them longer than he did, if he minds. But the boots don't answer. They just creak a little, every now and then, as if to say, keep walking. I remember. Going home wasn't going back. You thought it would feel like relief. That the moment your boots touched the familiar road, something in your chest would unclench. That the smell of wood smoke and bread would rise through the air and make the frost in your bones finally melt. But it didn't. There was no parade, no warm arms waiting at the gate, just the quiet sound of your own breath as you stepped over the threshold with boots that didn't belong to you, shoulders bent in ways they never were before. The house was still there, the roof still sloped, the shutters still crooked, but everything felt smaller now and quieter, like the world had moved on without asking you to come. You looked at the door and remembered how it used to groan on cold mornings. You remembered the table where you ate with both hands, the one chair that always wobbled. You remembered laughter, faces you hadn't seen in years. But they didn't come rushing back. They stayed where you left them, etched in time, untouched by what you had become. Inside, the silence was louder than cannon fire. The walls held your breath like they didn't recognize it. You walked slowly, not from pain, but from unfamiliarity. Your own home had become a stranger. The bed didn't feel soft. The floor didn't feel steady. You took off your coat, but the cold stayed anyway. People asked you where you had been, what you had seen, how it ended. But their eyes always looked just past you, as if you were smoke, as if your words would stain the walls if spoken too clearly, so you didn't tell them. Not about Fétienne, not about the boots, not about the blood, or the mountain, or the long, sideways dying. You just said, we came back, and hoped they wouldn't ask who we was. Sometimes you walked to the edge of the field and stared at the trees, half expecting the line of marchers to appear again, half wishing they would, because at least then you would know where to go. Here, the map was blank. The fires didn't need tending. The rifles stayed quiet, and your hands, so used to holding everything tightly, didn't know what to do with peace. They shook sometimes for no reason at all. The ground was dry, but your feet still moved like they were trudging through snow. People smiled at you. You smiled back. But it was always the kind of smile that said, I'm still there, still marching, still trying to get home. But going home wasn't going back. Going home was standing in the same place and realizing the man who left had died somewhere on the road, and the one who returned didn't know how to explain it, didn't know how to unpack it. He just stood there, boots too heavy, mouth too quiet, heart still listening for the sound of cannon fire in the distance, just in case. So now you know what it was like to be Napoleon's soldier. Not the glory in the paintings, not the medals in the glass case, just the weight of boots that weren't yours. The silence of names you stopped saying. The cold that moved in and never left. You marched because they told you to. You fought because there was no other option. And when it was over, if it ever really ended, you came home to a place that no longer fit the shape of your shadow. You didn't need victory, you needed warmth. You needed to sleep without flinching, to eat without rationing, the memory of taste. But the war didn't let go. Not even when the musket stopped, it stayed in your fingers, your breath, your dreams. And though no one asks anymore, not really, you still hear the question behind their eyes. Was it worth it? You don't answer. You just look down at your boots. One pair yours, one pair borrowed, both worn thin by miles, no one will ever count. Thank you for spending time in the quiet corners of history. Sleep well tonight. The march is over now, the fire, and for once there is no order to obey,